Welcome to Refused Flank, a wargaming podcast exploring the intersection of competitive excellence and narrative storytelling potential.
Okay, cool. Well, I'm rolling, so we can dive in whenever you're ready.
Okay. This is Refused Flank. I'm Grant.
And I'm Cam.
And we're today going to talk about scenarios, and we're probably going to be focusing a bit on, again, Warhammer Fantasy Battle 6th edition, and just we're going to be walking through our scenario kind of process. But beyond that, just talking about scenarios in general and the benefits of using them over just going back to the book and just rolling a pitched battle over and over and over again.
Yes. Yeah. And I think on top of that, just talking about adding some narrative story elements to it as well, even if you are just playing a standard scenario, and what that can bring to the experience as well. I think we could and probably will do a whole episode on just storytelling in wargaming generally, because there's a lot that could be said about that. But the design of the scenario itself, I think, is a core part of what adds some of that narrative storytelling flavor to a game.
For sure. And I think, again, we've talked about that kind of generally a lot, where it's this idea of you get people involved in the story and the game is thus more memorable because of it. It's not, and while you're playing, generally everybody's more invested in the story itself, and thus that kind of adds this levity to the entire experience, to where people aren't getting as focused on winning and losing. It's more about what are we collectively kind of telling a story on, and sure, we're trying or whatever, but we're gaining something out of this, even if we're just getting, throttled for whatever reason.
Yeah. And I think, for example, like if you're naming your characters and you have sort of this lore of who your army is, and you know why you're here at this battlefield, why you're fighting for this objective, it can help you tell the story as you're getting destroyed by your opponent, and see it as this forlorn hope defense that you might be fighting in a way that would be really cool if you were watching it in a movie, but can feel really bad when it's happening to you on the tabletop. And I think this can help mitigate that to some degree. But I think for me also, it just seems like the natural conclusion of wargaming, because you spend so much time and effort building, painting, modeling your troops to create this realistic experience that's simulating a battle. And then if all you do is throw them into some sort of an abstract scenario where you just throw your armies at each other and roll some dice, it feels a little bit like you stopped short of what it was supposed to be. You're not fully coming to the fruition of what wargaming can become. And at that point, it feels like, why did you waste all the time painting your army when you could have just played chess if you just wanted that abstract outcome kind of a situation? So I know that's an extreme way to paint that. But I think for me, that's just what I love about it, is the reason I'm painting everything and putting all this time and effort into building and modeling all of these troops and terrain is because I want to craft a world and a story around them on the battlefield.
For sure. And when you're describing all that, it makes me think of just you bringing this up. Everybody kind of gets their fun a little bit differently. Yeah. And the people who are just really their A game is just the game, the mechanics, and they don't care that they'll name their characters because you ask them to or whatever, and they get the AI generator to come up with them. And that's fine, by the way. I leverage the tools, but like, you know what I mean? Their heart's not in it as much because they're just not getting as much. But there are people who really do. And you know what? Those people don't always, I think, know right away until somebody else kind of takes the lead and it's like shows them the door. Yeah. And because they don't know. And then they end up being some of your most passionate group members or whatever. Or
yeah, because now it's their guys and their story, their army, their chapter, etc. that's fighting. And I think building that lore around your own troops for me is really exciting. I would always want to create more of a custom faction and story rather than just being like, I'm going to play Ultramarines or something like that. I would want it to be a succession chapter or whatever that has its own background and all of that, because that's what excites me about it. But I know that that's not what everybody's here for. But I would say, for the sake of people like me, even if you could care less about the narrative and story,
sure,
it really helps me if you name your guys and at least tell me what chapter your Space Marines are, so that I can make the story in my own head, even if you're not really too worried about it.
And I think maybe I'll provide a little bit of contrast here. I think I've come towards you in this, but again, I think 10 years ago, I was like, whatever, who cares? Yeah. But for me, I've always struggled when making my forces. I think I have a little bit of a what's the color scheme on the book problem, and I like to copy that because I'm like, that's what the army's supposed to look like in my head or whatever. So I have a hard time being like, I'll just make my Lizardmen pink or whatever. Right. I'm just gonna make a pink Lizardmen army. Now I do every so often I'll have some random stuff like my Stegodon's purple or whatever. I don't think you see that super often, but that's usually it's kind of just random little one-offs. It's never like the whole scheme or whatever, the main color identities and stuff like that. And I think for me, it's helpful to just kind of latch on to existing story bits as kind of a pillar, and then I build off of them. Yeah. So like going away from fantasy for a bit, we're starting a 4th ed 40K campaign. We've just done a quick series of games at this point, but I'm doing a Night Lords one group or whatever. And they just have a silly name like Dread Talons, or I think Dread Terrors. Yeah. The war band. But again, I didn't like come up with a custom chaos force or whatever. I just was like, yeah, they're Night Lords, but they're like a splinter war band. They believe in curs because I genuinely like the lore behind that legion and whatnot. But all that to say, you can integrate both custom stuff as well as,
existing lore,
existing lore, and then gain narrative significance from both with everybody who's kind of participating. So.
Yeah, and even just telling new stories with existing factions. Like I have painted my Empire army as Talabheim, and part of that's just the nostalgia of that red and white livery burned into my brain from having the rule book as a kid. And so I just had to paint them that way when I finally got the army later in life. But I can still tell new stories with those Talabheim troops, or, it could be a lesser count within or baron within the land holdings of Talabheim, etc. So yeah, there's lots of opportunities there. But I think a good example of, I would say I would encourage everybody, just as a baseline, to name your characters, because just doing that adds so much life and interest, and as they're operating on the battlefield, you can even be saying that this dude is walking across, Sir Warren Remick of the 4th Battalion is carrying his banner and he's at the front of the line here. And that just adds that visual cinematic quality to things that I think helps everybody see it. So I would encourage everybody just to start there, but then, maybe start naming your units, things like that. And then keeping track of just some of the cool things that have happened. One example of that was in our recent Slow Grow Warhammer Fantasy campaign. Early on in one of the battles, my Bretonnian opponent had a character named Baron Tybalt, and my dwarf Thane challenged him to single combat, and his champion took the challenge instead of Baron Tybalt. And then
I remember this.
And
the dishonor.
Yes, so dishonorable. And so I, of course, destroyed the champion and then ended up losing the battle. And so that was a grudge that my dwarves held the rest of the campaign. And in the final battle, we were able to recreate that into one of my objectives as the dwarves, was to kill Baron Tybalt to get revenge for that slight of honor against us. And so that's something that stuck in my head because the guy had a name, Baron Tybalt, and that's the guy that it was. So it needs to be that guy in the final battle, not just any character from the Bretonnian army. It has to be Baron Tybalt that's going to die. And so it's just, little moments like that stick in your brain otherwise. That's just my encouragement. It's just as a baseline, name your characters.
What do you think about people who, and I'm trying to think of the good way to say this, but maybe they feel awkward about doing that at first? How would you approach it if you're in, like, I don't know, and maybe we're going down into psychology here, Cam, but like, I think there's a little bit of an aspect to wargaming, especially in Warhammer.
Like, I don't want to be too much of a nerd if I
right.
Name my
there's
guys.
A little bit, and
I think we're too far gone.
I'm trying to
already
think.
Painted
maybe
army.
we're probably too far gone, Cam. But I think there's a lot of people who have a little bit of the gamer shame. Mm-hmm. Is that maybe that? I don't know if that's the right term. I'm pretty open at this point. People are like, "What do you do?" I'm like, "Well, I paint plastic soldiers and simulate fantastical battles." And they're like, "Oh, okay." And I'm like, "Yeah, no, it's super metal. It's awesome." But I feel like some people, for them, they and maybe this isn't as true anymore. Mm-hmm. I think this sort of stuff, nerd culture, is more popular than ever or whatever. Yeah. But I still think there's a little bit of
Yeah, I want to be into it, but I want to be too into it because that's weird.
And people are like, almost like, well, like
it's like playing D&D
right.
versus LARPing.
For example, when I met my wife when we were just dating, when I explained what I did this or whatever, wargaming to her, she's like, so do you like dress up when you go do this?
And I've had people ask me that too.
And I'm always like, nope, we're just staying at the table. We're normal. We're just wearing normal clothes or whatever. Cause there's these preconceived notions. People are like, oh, they must be like LARPers or something. Right. And I think for some people, there's like this aspect of like, oh, I'm like putting too much into it or whatever.
Yeah,
it's just a game. Am I being weird? And I guess just to jump off of you or of your comment, and I think I asked you this, but now I'm just going off with it, so I apologize. But if you're in a group and you guys, you don't see people doing this, just be the one to just start doing it yourself. And don't be like, hey guys, we should all just start naming our characters or whatever. But if you're like, hey, I'm going to start naming mine, and you come up with some cool names or whatever after a little bit of trial and error, or one does something really cool, and then you remember that guy's name.
Remembers it,
and then they're like, oh man, Baron von Schwaffenhofen.
And then they want a guy that's going to be like that everyone else will remember.
Exactly. So it kind of invites the spirit.
That would exactly be my answer as well. And I think you bring up a good point about everybody's got a line that they would say like, oh, well, but I don't do that. And so I think that's good for me to remember too. I haven't dressed up to a game, but I wouldn't be bothered by somebody who did. And maybe that's what you got to do.
We're going to play Here I Stand at some point. I'm going to get everybody to dress in a period appropriate garb for 10 hours. For it.
I don't know why we only do that once a year at Halloween, we should dress up more often.
Yeah, that'd be funny.
But I think, that's just exactly what you said, being the one to do it and just show that it's cool or not, and then people can do it themselves if they want. If you need ideas for starting to do that, I know sometimes it's hard to come up with names, but obviously with AI, large language models these days, that's going to help a lot. One thing that I do that I enjoy is I'll just look up a thematic word in another language and then modify that a little bit to sound more like a name. And so I was doing a sort of bespoke Inquisimunda campaign a few years ago and named my gang, which was like an expedition going somewhere, the Kulkerth expedition, which I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, but it's the Welsh word for rust, I think. I can't even remember now. But anyway, so it was like, I was these like really grungy Mechanicus dudes from some sort of tech world or something. And so I was like, well, if I go find Welsh words that sound cool and mean things like rust and spark and that sort of thing, I can use those to name my guys and my gang and all of that. And then for me, I don't need to like tell everybody else that that's what it is, but then I had a reason to pick a word rather than something else. And then it's actually a word. And so, I think that's just a cool way to do it.
No, I think that's a handy tip for everybody who's kind of just like, oh, I'm not creative. I'm not, what's your guy's name? Boris, or I don't know. Actually, I like Boris.
Yeah,
there needs to be more Borises, but like, I don't know, Bob or John or what. I don't know. They're like, Grant. I'm going to name my character after me.
Yeah, my one of my friends growing up when we would play battle companies for Lord of the Rings would name all his guys like Bob and stuff. So
Bob,
Bob the Goblin.
I guess if you just lean in hard enough, like eventually a Bob will stick. Maybe it'd get a little hokey after a while. I don't know.
It drives me nuts, but that's okay.
Okay, fair enough. Let's. I think I took us down that rabbit hole.
Yeah, I think we're getting into our full episode on storytelling in games. So let's redirect back to just scenarios.
So, what would be? We've highlighted out here a bunch of different approaches to scenario design. Do you want to just kind of go into those?
Yeah, absolutely. So choosing a scenario can be as simple or as complicated as you want. Obviously, the most basic is you just set your guys up and then start playing the game. And there's not really a scenario, it's just you fight to the death kind of a thing. And that scenario exists in most war games. It's usually called something like pitched battle. And it's good for starting out because then you can focus more on the mechanics than you are about the objectives or the intricacies of the scenario. But there's a lot of other ways that you can go about doing that. The scenario itself, when you have a scenario that has specific objectives, that usually hints at or is sort of adjacent to adding some narrative. And so I think that's a great place to start, is just use an existing standard scenario. So the big rule book in Warhammer Fantasy, for example, has a number of scenarios. They have some of the basic ones that you can roll a d6 and it'll give you one, but then they have a few other sort of like weird scenarios where it's like 7 heroes against a whole army and stuff like that. So they even have some of those more narrative ones built in there. But even doing one of the basic ones and then adding a little bit of story on top of that based on what it's hinting at can be helpful. So for example, something like the capture scenario where you're attempting to take control of a piece of terrain in the center of the battlefield. Now you just have to imagine, okay, what would these two armies be fighting over that would be in the center of this battlefield? Is it a wizard's tower? Is it an arcane artifact? Is it just an important piece of ground that's, part of like a bridge or a mountain pass or something like that? And then you can just start to imagine, okay, why do my guys want that? Why do your guys want that? And you can come up with a little bit of a story just for that one-off kind of a game. And if you're looking for more scenarios, I think it's just worth pointing out that the guys that run Resurrection does a lot of really good scenarios. They have a scenario pack available on the Facebook page. So if you haven't seen that, go check that out. But there's a lot of really cool scenarios that really just change things up and I think give you a lot of cool ideas for narratives.
And just worth pointing out too, in at least the 6th edition big rule book, like all of the scenarios, even pitched battle and breakthrough, the generic ones, they even have a whole little back part that's like historical refight.
Yeah, that is like this battle actually happened in Warhammer history.
Yeah, and I like that just for inspiration purposes. I don't think I'm going to necessarily go back and fight that, or and maybe I'm wrong. Maybe one day we'll be like, hey, we just happen to have these armies. You want to just like do this? I don't know. Maybe that'll happen. But for me, it's just this idea of like sparking something else. Being like, oh, I like a part of that. And then, ooh, maybe I want to lift that, but then something else here. And then, oh, I've got a different idea that I can plug in with it.
Yeah. And that's why I think it's worth reading all the little short stories that are peppered throughout the rule book and the army books, because it'll just give you all those little narrative hooks that could make for interesting battles. But yeah, I like that they build that into the scenarios themselves, like you're saying. Another just kind of general thought I think I'll point out is that the scenario itself can help something that we talked about in our last episode about building army lists, which is just helping create a challenge that's fun for both players. And in the opening section of the scenario chapter in the Warhammer Fantasy 6th edition rulebook, it does explicitly say, let me see if I can find it here. Different scenarios require the players to re-examine their army choices and tactics and ensure that every game is always different to the last. A player might choose an army which they feel confident can beat any foe in a pitched battle, but how would they fare if faced with fighting a last stand? And it's this variety which constantly tests the generalship of the players, and every battle tells a different story and adds to the history of your army. And so I love that that's just in the rule book. They're not just cutting to the chase and saying, here's the rules, let's get at it. They're trying to evoke this sense of, we're here fighting for a reason, there's a story going on. And also acknowledging that if all you do is play pitched battle, then yeah, there's probably going to be a meta list that will win that every time. But if you start introducing interesting scenarios with varying objectives, then you're not going to be able to just take the same army. It's going to invite you to try different builds and try different tactics and things like that. And that's something that cooperatively, like the list building, you could cooperatively decide to do a certain scenario with somebody that might challenge you a little more than it would challenge them, etc. And that can be great for improving somebody's skill level.
I think too, for those who are maybe more gun shy about like house ruling, point values and army or unit entries and stuff, like we kind of went over a little bit in our army reviews. Scenarios provide you an option to kind of tweak that, but it may be in a way
wholesale changes
that doesn't feel as invasive because it's a one-off or whatever.
That's a great
even
point.
Though you could say the other one is a one-off too, right? I mean, it's a house rule, but you
it
get
feels
what I'm
less
saying?
Intrusive,
right? You could. It's easier to sell to a group. Be like, hey, we're gonna have this battle, and because it's held at the Church of Sigmar or whatever outside the gates, the battle priests here, they're gonna get different prayers, and they just for this battle or whatever, and here's what they are, or, something like that. And then that's a lot easier of a sell to a group who
rather than I'm going to change the fundamental mechanics of my army.
Fundamentally what the entry is for this unit or whatever. And I think that's something that's really valuable, that again, if you're just playing pitched battle, meeting engagement over and over again, you probably won't always get to experience that, even if the scenario, worth noting, might just be a pitched battle or a meeting engagement, but narratively it's outside the gates or whatever, so you're doing X, Y, and Z. Now hopefully over time you put other stuff in there too, but a good starting point.
And I think that's kind of the second approach, which would be take a standard scenario but just add a couple tweaks in order to make it a little bit different. We just did this recently in our 40K 4th edition slow grow, our first round of the campaign is round robin. Everybody's going to play everybody in sort of a recon mission. And so we used a basic mission called Take and Hold, or I can't remember what it's called, but essentially there's 3 objectives and you have to go flip them over.
Maybe.
Something like that.
I don't know.
But you go flip the objectives with your troops, and then one of them is the real objective, and then you're supposed to run away with it. But we added on top of that a rule where you can, instead of shooting on your turn, try to spot enemy units and gather intelligence about them, and that will also get you victory points. And so instead of making it an all or nothing, you either have the objective or you don't. Getting the objective is worth 3 points if you get it off the table, 1 point if you own it while still on the table, and then spotting an enemy unit is worth 1 point. And so you have the opportunity to build up some points in different ways, but it also then feels much more narratively intentional that like, okay, we all just are on this planet now trying to figure out who's here, what are they doing, who's trying to do what, and get a little bit more information from and about each other. And adding that little bit of a twist to the existing scenario isn't game breaking, makes it a little more interesting, and ties it into the narrative of what's actually going on. So I think that's a really good approach and useful if you're just getting started.
I think that's a great example, because just pulling, again, maybe getting too nitty gritty here, but in my first round game or whatever, I was doing Night Lords, and that produced what I felt like was an interesting narrative situation to where I was just kind of killing the opponent over and over, but he kind of won on VPs. Neither one was able to really get the objective off the board for whatever reason, but I just kind of kept chopping guys or whatever, because again, it's like narrative to me, it's like, well, they're the Night Lords, we just want to kind of murder some of these blokes, but he was doing more of the recon stuff, so he would spend, at least in the last couple rounds, he wouldn't even shoot. He'd just be like, well, let's do the recon thing, try to get points that way, whereas I was just, let's pick up models off the opponent. So I like lost the game on VP, but it's created this kind of cool, like now I'm thinking about it narratively, like, well, maybe my guys don't care about that. They just want to chop up guys, or at least those dudes did. Maybe that leader, you know, who was in charge of that, he's just kind of, I'm just going to go kill. And that's, again, kind of, we're talking about this just as we go, but it's like organic, again, emergent.
Yes. Yeah.
Like that emergent just kind of pops out, right? I didn't go into that game thinking like, oh yeah, I'm just going to do this, but it just kind of happened over the course of the game. And I was like, oh, well, maybe I'm going to roll with that now, as I've kind of discovered that just in one round. Right. So.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think maybe it's also worth bringing up right now, since we're talking about that game and the fact that nobody could get the objective off the battlefield. Okay. There seemed to be a typo in the mission that we were basing this off of, and so the deployment zone started too far back, and so I think it was literally impossible unless you had like jump troops or something, or a transport, to go get the objective and get off the table with it. And at combat patrol levels 400 points, it's a lot harder to have some of that stuff. But that's something to keep in mind as you're designing scenarios, is try not to design things that become impossible. That's something that happened with a scenario I did for one of our Warhammer Fantasy Battle campaigns, where my dwarf reinforcements were never going to make it in time because they came on from the short table edges, and dwarfs are just so slow that they just weren't going to get into combat by the time the game ended. And so it was like a cool idea for the whole scenario, and it worked really well, except for the fact that my reinforcements never actually made it into contact with the enemy. Maybe one unit did, I can't remember, but yeah, so it was just kind of like, well, that's fine. But it's something to think about. Like, that's a really basic thing, is just to, run the math on how far does a guy move per turn? Where are they supposed to get in order to achieve this objective? And is that literally possible?
But also in along with that, I would say too, don't be afraid of like
just trying stuff and find out
like the wrong choice and being like, that's wow, good. That was really messed up, or just learn for next time. I feel like we've gotten better.
Definitely.
Because we've made mistakes like that, being like, oh yeah, no, this was just terribly unfair, and we didn't. And you know what? Part of that's really hard to know ahead of time because there's so many variables. So give your guys, if you're doing this, give yourself grace, because terrain placement, the matchups between the forces themselves, the players as well,
can all play into that.
So what you might, you give two different players the exact same two armies on the same table, you probably get a different result versus, and you switch any one of the, you get different results. So it's just one of those things, but sometimes you get these one-sided games and you're like, oh man, was my scenario just complete garbage? I'm not going to do that again. Back to pitch battle. Yeah. But just taking your lumps, so to speak, they're not lumps, but just learning from it
And then just apply those lessons on the next one.
Yeah, intimidated or disheartened.
Yeah, I think that's a really good reminder. And then I would say that it can be helpful to have, this would maybe go back to that idea of having an umpire, because obviously they're more able to try to assess who are the players, what are their armies, and then make a scenario that would help fit with both of those. But you can kind of do that if you have a group. And so for our campaigns that we do, if I'm going to make a custom scenario, I will take those things into account and think about, who is fighting. If it's Bretonia and they have all these really fast things, then that's going to matter to me as I'm thinking about how to design the scenario, so it doesn't completely eliminate their bonuses by being fast and things like that, or vice versa with the dwarfs. Right. And so being able to do that for other players is really helpful, because you can be a little bit more objective about that. So that's something to consider as well, is maybe just ask somebody who's not playing the actual battle to be involved in the scenario design, or at least give their thoughts after you've designed the scenario, so you can see that. And then I do want to circle back just to one thing you said earlier, because it's a really good point, I think, about how a minor tweak to that 40K mission could really evoke a different narrative for you. And then the idea that the Imperial Guard are gathering more intelligence, even though their platoon is getting decimated right now, but they're radioing it all back to command. And so in the broader scheme of this whole campaign, that was obviously worth the sacrifice to the Imperial commanders. Like, yeah, we didn't need those guys anyways. That was why we sent them out there. They got us the data we needed. And now we'll be able to be in a better position for the next battle. And so I think these little additions of story into a scenario help you see that big picture and get a little less myopic about, oh, my guys are just dying right now, because you can imagine the the Raptors, I see him coming in at us, but this guy's on the comms and he's sending it back to HQ, and if he can get this through, then it's gonna be worth the sacrifice. And that's just way more fun and way more exciting to die that way than to just die.
Yeah. It's not just, we were on this ground and we were meant to hold here because of some reason, and we got killed to a man. Exactly. Oh no.
Yeah, so moving on, I think another way you can do it, there's obviously tons of narrative scenarios that exist. There was a lot of those put out in White Dwarf and some of the compendiums, and things like the General's Compendium was one that has just a ton of cool narrative scenarios. Like you said, the main rulebook has some as well. Yeah, multiplayer.
It's crazy.
So there's all sorts of really interesting narrative scenarios that you can just find that are already pre-written. Some of them work better than others. It's pretty clear that some of the ones that even were published weren't really well play tested, or just don't work well for certain armies and things like that. But again, that's okay, and hopefully is encouraging that even the professionals were making some mistakes sometimes, or not thinking things through for every army, and that's okay.
Wasn't there famously, I think it's an 8th ed fantasy, is the scenario called Watchtower? There's a big building in the center, and that was universally panned or whatever.
Oh, really? I haven't heard of that.
Maybe not universally panned, but it was you'd watch tournaments or battle reports, people would roll it or whatever, and be like, okay, well, we don't want to play what, and they'd re-roll it or whatever. And it's because it was, the building rules were really finicky, and it was just
not worth bothering.
And people are we're not, it's playing a different game. It's you got in there first and you have elite guys, so now I have to fight 2 versus 2 on the stairs to see if I can knock you. And it was just, people are oh, I hate this. But yeah, no, just jumping off of this idea of the professionals don't always know what they are doing either.
Yeah.
Maybe that didn't evoke a very good response, but maybe in the right setup, though, maybe that would work well. Yeah. And maybe you just steal that and throw that into your own thing. And
right, for a specific situation, etc. Yeah. And so that brings us to our next point, which is you can obviously completely just make up your own scenarios yourself. And that can be for a cool narrative idea that you have. Maybe it's something that came to mind from watching a movie or reading a book, or reading just some of the lore or little narrative snippets from the rule book or army books. And you can then just go hog wild, make it as complicated as you want. I think it's easy to maybe go a little too far in that direction and make things a little too complicated. So you do want to think about, who are my players? Is it somebody, if I'm designing one for myself and Grant to play, I know I can get a little crunchier with some of the special rules. But there's other players that I know just wouldn't be as interested in minutia in the scenario rules. They're more just interested in playing the battle and rolling the dice. And so I don't want to overburden them with something that's going to make their experience not as fun. But you can really shape it then to try to create these scenario special rules that will evoke the type of narrative story that you're trying to tell. And for me, that's really exciting. I really love doing that. One example that we did a year or so ago was a scenario that I designed that's an ambush in the jungle. And so
that was a good game.
Yeah. And so that was specifically designed for me to play as my Empire, you to play as your Lizardmen. And there's this whole marching order that the Empire start with. The entire board is just a road going through the jungle. So 2 sides of the board are dense jungle and the rest is open road. We pulled in some of the rules from the Lustria source book for fighting in loose formations and things like that in the jungle. And then we added some additional rules about having the Empire had some supply wagons or treasure wagons that they were trying to get across the table. And that was their main objective. And the Lizardmen were trying to prevent that from happening. But we did a whole thing with like hidden deployment, and I didn't know where your units were. You had counters that you were moving around, and you had some additional ones that were sort of like fake. So you could trick me into thinking like, which you did successfully, and drew one of my units out and across into the wrong side of the road.
Didn't the caravan make it out though? I thought it did.
I think I got one off.
Okay, maybe one.
I can't remember what the actual outcome was.
I remember now that you're articulating. I'm like, oh yeah, with the counter movement. Yeah. This was awesome, you guys.
Yeah, it was one of my all-time favorite scenarios.
That was a good game.
Yeah. And maybe we'll throw a link to it up in the comments or something if you want to try it out and let us know how it works for you. But it was just really fun. It, for me, was the scenario I've played that felt the most like it did actually model a really cinematic situation where a really claustrophobic, non-maneuverable army was marching through the jungle and then just got ambushed and chaos ensued because my units were just like all over the place trying to turn to face the foe and just failing to do so, but like having some victories here and there. And it was just really exciting, really fun, and presented really interesting tactical challenges to have to try and deal with.
And I think that was also another one where we built the lists cooperatively. So we were like, okay, Grant, don't take, a Carnosaur that's going to get the flank charge for free, or don't take the, not that we were going to do that, but like we were both building it together to be like, what makes sense for an ambushing force for Lizardmen? I don't know if I had any Saurus warriors in that entire
I don't think
army.
you did, because that way you could move through the jungle, no problem.
Right.
Yeah.
So it was like,
I think you did have the Stegodon though. I think I remember that busting through the canopy, the edge of the forest, and it was just this amazing moment of like, oh my gosh, it's right there.
Yeah, I think I was like all skinks, and that was cool though, because
that was exactly the scenario where it makes sense.
They're in loose formation, and then there's all these. Yeah, no, that was great.
I think that's the scenario I've also taken the most free company, and I took just full units of free company on their own.
There was a lot of bodies.
But yeah, so that's an example of just totally making up your own thing. And I often use just a combination of taking an existing scenario and tweaking it. It's not as frequent that I'll make a completely bespoke scenario, but I think it's cool to do, especially for set piece battles. So for example, the final battle for our last Warhammer Fantasy Battle campaign that we just finished up was a big it turned into 5-player multiplayer battle where we were fighting over this lost city in the jungle that we had finally found, and everybody had different objectives and everybody had cool things that they could do with their secondary points from throughout the campaign and things like that. So there's lots of opportunities to add those things in, and it can be as much or as little work as you want.
And that kind of rolls into this final thought, right? Like, what about extending this into campaign play and narrative? Like, I mean, you just kind of brought that up.
Yeah.
How does somebody even begin to do that? Let's just say they're playing Warhammer Fantasy. They've got 2 friends that they've conned in to play the game with them, and they're like, I want to do a slow grow with them. I want to have a narrative campaign.
Yeah.
But they're like, I don't know. What do we do? Map? Because you see these big hex board things on like Reddit and Facebook, and it's like, oh wow, that looks amazing, but is there all this overhead and
one of the things I liked about some of the older Warhammer rule books is that they had a lot of ideas for different types of campaigns. I think the 4th edition 40K book is an exemplary example of this. And maybe that's redundant. I don't know. But anyways, they have several different types of campaigns that they talk about, like ladder campaigns, node-based campaigns, things like that. And so you can really get a lot of ideas for how to do that. But I think campaigns don't need to be as intimidating as sometimes they seem to be it's sort of like seeing really well painted miniatures on Instagram, and it just makes you feel like I'm never going to paint well. And so you see like people talking about these really elaborate, cool campaigns that they've done, or, you're reading through the General's Compendium and you see like they built this 3-dimensional campaign map and they're using War Master armies to move them around to indicate where the battles take place and things. And you're like, wow, that's so cool, but I could never actually pull that off. But you don't have to, because you can make a campaign with a lot of different tiers of complication. So you can use a combination of the above approaches to designing scenarios so that you have some sort of an ongoing story that's going to play out through it. That could be something that's a little bit more set in stone if you want, or it could be more of that emergent story and you just kind of see what happens after the first battle and then let that inform what the story is moving forward. That's kind of how we're playing the current 40K 4th Ed slow grow campaign, and sort of how we did the last one for fantasy, where we'll just play out each round and then we'll work together to cooperatively tell the story of whatever our army is going to do next, and then we can come up with scenarios and matchups based on that. But here's just a few different ideas for what you could do. So like if you wanted to take, for example, one battle and turn it into a mini campaign, you could add something like veterancy. So maybe you pick one unit that you think performed particularly well, or maybe you do the thing where like your opponent gets to pick one of your units that they think was the MVP or something like that, which obviously you have to do with a good faith opponent who's going to actually pick a good one. But
we're assuming good faith opponent.
That's true. Let's just say that as a baseline. Everything we talk about on this podcast is assuming good faith opponents.
We assume people aren't being bad people.
Yeah. And there's a lot of things you could do with veterancy. Our first fantasy slow grow campaign, I think I made a little too complicated, but a really simple way to do veterancy is just to say a veteran unit gets one free reroll per game. And so that's just a nice, meaningful thing that could make or break an important moment in the game, whether it's getting that extra wound or it's not failing that break test because you get to reroll one of those dice. And so that can be really cool and just make it feel like, yeah, these are more battle-hardened veterans kind of a thing. So that's one thing you can do. Another thing you could do is reward whoever won the first scenario with something for the next scenario. I think this is easy to get a little carried away with and make them too powerful, and you get this snowball effect.
Yeah.
So I think leaning on the side of lesser rewards is better, but still something that feels like at least I got to do this thing. So that could be whoever wins gets to choose what the next scenario is from whatever they want. They could maybe just be automatically choosing their deployment zone or who goes first. Maybe they're the one that's going to be able to set up the terrain to indicate that their army got to choose where the battle was going to happen.
They scouted it.
Yeah,
they
exactly.
arrived first.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And that can be really cool and feel like a reward, especially if it's like, oh, now I can take my unit of 10 handgunners in 2 ranks of 5 and put them on the hill that I scouted out and made sure the battle happened at this battlefield with a hill in my deployment zone. And so that can be helpful. So there's a lot of those little ways that you can string just otherwise what would be random battles together into a short little mini campaign, maybe just 3 games or something like that. But feel like it's meaningfully connected by giving a little bit of a reward to whoever won and giving both players the chance to get veteran units and things like that.
I just want to bounce off of that briefly just because I had a point for that. And it's just this idea of, again, ask your players. I mean, we're kind of talking as if there's somebody who's kind of, the listener is like the guy in charge. They're the umpire or whatever. But like, ask your group members, hey, what do you guys think?
Yeah.
Get their input. They may have ideas that you haven't thought of, that we haven't thought of, that are really cool. And it's almost like before we do big war game campaigns, we don't quite have a session 0 or anything like that, but we've kind of like, we have a discussion, even if it's just text based in like
Discord
a Discord
or whatever. Yeah.
And it's this idea of like, well, what is everybody kind of looking for? Do you guys want to have like a bunch of overhead, a bunch of like, we're moving hexes, we're tracking.
We need to worry about supply lines.
Right. Is that something you guys are actually interested in? And hoping everybody's being genuine and because if everybody's like, oh yeah, no, for sure. And then after round 2, they're like, oh man, this is a big pain in the butt. And like nobody cares and they just want to do the fight. Okay. Learn that lesson. And then next time, if you guys do it again or something similar, be like, okay, hey, I noticed nobody really got invested in X.
Right.
What about Y? How about instead of we're doing the map-based campaign or whatever, where we're tracking all these little things, kind of going to what you said, start small, being like, how about we just track veterancy? How about we just do one of these little things and then we can track that over 5 games or whatever and see where that takes us. And then if we thought that wasn't enough, maybe we add something else on there or whatever. Yeah.
And I would say err on the side of too little first and then build up, because nothing will kill a campaign faster than people feeling like there's too much busy work involved.
Yes.
So yeah, but that's a good point. Just talking to people and seeing what they're interested in is helpful. I've kind of picked up on that a little bit over the 3 campaigns that we've done now.
Yeah.
And that's helped me calibrate a little bit, because definitely I erred on the side of more complicated earlier on and have simplified things a little bit as we've moved forward.
I think we've just learned that listeners will know this too. It's just everybody in the group is of a different level of investment.
Yeah, what they want out of a war game in general, right. Yeah.
So like some people are like, this is what I'm all in. Like I'm going to be writing lore, probably more than maybe even us, right? Yeah. They're like, they might be writing pages of backstory and stuff, really invested. Other people are just showing up.
Yeah, and saying, right? I named my characters for you, Cam, because you asked me to.
I named my characters, Cam, and here are the VPs I got at the end of the round. And we're like, okay, well, what are you guys going to do? And they're like, yeah, I don't know. We're going to go attack them. And it's like, and that's the level of investment. Yeah. And that's fine, you know, and there's nothing wrong with that. But just being able to like, work with that and level those expectations in the beginning, so that people aren't like expecting pages of backstory or whatever.
Yeah.
And then
so again, you get people.
Yeah. So, I mean, again, we're kind of talking about common courtesy. Don't be a weirdo. Don't be mean. But I think this is because of, you mentioned like Instagram and Facebook and Reddit or whatever, social media in general. You see like these big, super intricate things that are gorgeous. And you're like, oh, I want to try that. I want to do that. And you shoot for the moon or whatever, which is great. But then you don't land amongst the stars, unfortunately. You kind of
crash into the ocean.
You crash after 2 games, and then everybody's like, yeah, no. And
maybe we don't do a campaign
how about we just don't do that? I feel like I've seen, even amongst bigger, like other YouTubers or whatever, they'll do these slow grow campaigns, but they can only get through like 3 or 4 games. And I wonder, they don't always have the most narrative mindset. It's more like, we're just playing at 500, then we're playing at 1,000, then we're playing at 1,250 or whatever. And that's all that it is, just an excuse to paint and build, which is fine.
Yeah,
but I wonder if just having these custom scenarios, putting a little bit more effort in, and I think it's worth noting too, because for people who are listening, they're like, man, this sounds like a lot of work. I think there's some investment there, but like, this isn't like, and I'm not the most RPG experienced guy, but I would say this is easier than being a dungeon master. Definitely or something that. You're not building like a whole custom world and referencing
or improving a story for the entire session.
Right. You're just kind of like, okay, think like bullet points. Here's where we're at. Boom, 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 boom. If they kind of win, we'll just kind of come up with new bullet points. Boom, 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 boom.
Yeah, but I think that's a good way to do it. And that's where, for me, this sort of emergent story campaign approach is really useful, because you can just let the games tell you where the story's going rather than worrying too much about writing it yourself. But I think now we're getting into a whole episode about just campaign play. So let's get back on track here. And I think our next thing is going to be just using our upcoming game of Empire versus Lizardmen, using the army list we made in the last episode in order to design a scenario around that. So this will be sort of a case study of some of the ideas we've talked about. So to begin with, we already knew that we were going to be playing Lizardmen versus Empire. We built lists for sort of this general all-comers approach like we talked about, but with a few specific decisions as we work together to make those lists. So we don't have anything hyper specific that would necessarily play into the scenario in terms of the lists themselves.
Right.
We then decided that we would go with the approach where we just roll up a random scenario from the big rule book. So this would be probably the easiest approach, is just use a standard scenario. We got meeting engagement, which if you're not familiar with that, there's a slightly narrower deployment zone. I think you have to be 6 inches in from the short edges for that. And then you deploy in a pre-written marching order. So it's supposed to be mimicking your guys just arriving at the battlefield in their marching column and then sort of spreading out into the deployment zone. And so that's a really cool just twist on what otherwise would be a pitched battle, because you have to make some pre-decisions about how you're going to deploy, because as you deploy, they have to keep getting further out from the center in that order that you had pre-written. So that adds a nice little wrench in the works, but it also introduces some potential narrative plot hooks. So this is where, we could just play the scenario, but we could also take this opportunity to invent a little bit of story and narrative to go along with it. So knowing just the general lore from the armies and from what's given to us by the scenario, we can do some brainstorming. So one thing that I came up with as I was doing that was this idea that the Slann has led his army through a portal into the southern part of the Empire. I think that's just interesting, because then we're not fighting in the jungle like you would maybe traditionally think. That's also hinted at in the lore in the Lizardmen book, is that there are these lost portals kind of around the old world.
I think they take over Albion.
Oh, nice.
In that Dark Shadows campaign.
Is that how that ended?
I think Lizardmen like were one of the winners.
Nice.
And they like just like jungles start growing in Albion. So in like fantasy Britain, like Lizardmen kind of won enough that they just got like part of that, so I love that.
Yeah, that's great.
So it's not unprecedented.
Exactly. So yeah, and in the army book, it's talking about how there's these lost gates and the Slann may decide that they've, heard from the old ones and communicated through the skink priest that we need to go through this portal to, in this case, get an artifact back because it's critical to the great plan. And if it's going to happen, we have to have that artifact that got stolen from us 2 centuries ago. So we're going to go get it. So that's our Lizardmen. That's why they're showing up. So I'm imagining the portal is on the map or maybe just off the map, and the Lizardmen are coming out of it in their marching order and then arranging themselves in the deployment zone. So now we're already playing into that scenario.
Right.
From the Empire side, I know we've got Empire wizards in the army, so maybe one of them noticed fluctuations in the winds of magic when this portal was firing up. And so an army was sent out to go figure out like what's going on there. We thought that was just empty wilderness. And so the Empire army is marching up to the portal as the Lizardmen are now coming out of it. And so now we have a reason for both of those armies to be there. Maybe to make it make a little more sense and add another level is that the wizard, maybe the way he could tell that it was powering up is because he has that stolen artifact in his wizard tower. And so that's what was sensitive to the specifically Lizardmen portal powering up. And so he actually brought that with him to the battle. So now there's the possibility that the Lizardmen could just get it back right here and right now possibility. And so that would be like the most basic thing is like, we're just doing meeting engagement, no additional scenario rules, but now we have a story that we can be playing out. You're here for a reason.
And then
I'm
that combined with names, like you just with that, you could already do lots of little, especially with Empire, because they're human. You can do so much intrigue. It's a little harder with Lizardmen. I will admit, it'd be like, well, Lord Quex doesn't really trust his Scar veteran guard. And it's like, well, does he? But you could do like, why is the elector count here? Like was the portal just in his province or whatever, or did this wizard who's got the item kind of like, is he in his court or whatever? And it's like, hey, can you bring the troops over there?
This is really important.
Calamity or whatever. Yeah. And he's kind of getting the Empire army to show up to really just kind of guard himself.
Right, because he wants to go see what's going on.
Yeah. So a lot you could do with that, just kind of spitballing, real fast and loose.
And that's where, again, all of that just comes from a general sense of the lore from reading the army books and having watched and read fantasy movies and books and things like that. So you can do a lot with that. I would also say if this is even intimidating, just like, oh, well, I'm just not that creative, I wouldn't come up with stuff like that. That's, again, where something like ChatGPT can be really helpful. You can prompt it to like, help me brainstorm. And that's one of the things that tool is best at, is just bouncing ideas off and helping develop things a little bit along the way. So maybe describe to it the scenario that you're playing and what the armies are, and then it'll give you some narrative hooks you might be able to go with.
No shame in that
Not
whatsoever. So people who feel that way, I guess I wouldn't know what to say to you, but it used as a tool, it's great. Now, what I would say is don't just say generate a scenario or whatever, and then it just copy paste that into a Google Doc and send it to everybody.
Yeah. And now especially don't sell it to everybody and tell them it's made by you.
Yeah,
That's
do
where
that.
It gets bad.
Yeah, don't do that. But definitely a tool that can be of great use. So just wanted to throw that in there. But
so
keep going.
Back to in terms of our case study, just walking through those approaches you could take to this. The first one would be just play the meeting engagement as is with the story added on, but no changes to the scenario. But the next one would be you could add in a little extra objective, tweak the scenario a little bit. So typically meeting engagement is decided just by victory points. And so things for like capturing banners, BSBs, table quarters, kill points, things like that. But you could add in something that, okay, like I said, the stolen artifact is with the wizard on this battlefield. And so whoever ends the battle with that item, which you could say is captured like a BSB, so you have to like win in combat sort of a thing, then you get an extra 100 victory points. So it's not game breaking. It's not going to change everything. It's possible that somebody who was going to win anyways would win either way, whether they got it or not. But it could be the thing that tips it from a minor victory to a major victory, or a draw to a minor victory, something like that. And it might
be something that for the person who loses, if they get that, it's kind of like, well, I got that. It's a takeaway.
Yeah, so. Or it extends the story, like the Lizardmen crushed the Empire, but the wizard got away with the thing, and he just like took off after the battle. I was like, thanks, I now know what was there and what was magic, and I don't want any of it. Yep. And then he just leaves and goes hides. Yeah. So yeah, I think it also gives you something to do a little bit differently than just try to kill the enemy. Is maybe I'll make a little extra effort to go kill the unit that has that wizard in it, or maybe I'll make a little more effort to protect that wizard and not take as many risks with him. So it just adds a little bit of extra dimension to it without fundamentally changing anything too much. So I think that's a good approach as well. Some other things you could do, you could add in even more tweaks to the scenario. So maybe the Lizardmen army is still coming out of the portal, and that could be interesting. That could be a reason to do a cool terrain project and actually build the portal so that it's like a big, cool set piece on your table. And then maybe in that written marching order, 2 units are coming out per turn. And so there is sort of this like rolling reserves happening. And if you're going to do that, I think you'd probably want to reduce the number of points total that the Empire has, but maybe that also even plays into the narrative because the wizard couldn't convince the Elector Count to send an entire army with him. So he does have kind of a smaller scouting contingent. And then that would rely on the Empire being able to blitz the Lizardmen and sort of cut them apart before they have the full bulk of their force on the table. And so that would be just a really interesting tactical challenge as well. That one would be much more likely to just end up not working. And so you'd want to play it and find out and then maybe play it again and with some tweaks after you saw how it went. But that would be one way to do that. Any other tweaks you could think of or would have?
There's so many little things you could do. Just off the top of my head, just from maybe a more Lizardmen point of view, I guess. In thinking about, well, they're coming for this magical whatnot, this what's it, right? Thinking you could do just narratively, maybe something's pushing them out of the portal, and then if you have a third player or whatever, this is kind of just going off the tangent here, but like maybe you have a third player or another group member who wants to show up in a future game, a one-off. You could kind of write into like a backstory, their army. So maybe they're coming from a different portal that's in Nehekara for whatever reason, and you've got a Tomb King's player and you want to get him involved. Maybe he'll show up later. You can kind of precede a lot of that stuff, just acknowledging it. That's kind of just focusing on the narrative. As in terms of the scenario itself, I'm generally a more like less tweaks are the better, generally speaking. But I'm trying to think what would immediately come to mind.
Off the top of the head's hard. Sorry.
No, you're good. I'm trying to think of like immediately off the top of my head. I guess nothing immediate, but if you gave me like, I don't know, 20 minutes, I could probably come up with something. But generally speaking, I would do kind of the marching order as is. And if you wanted to adjust for balance reasons or whatever, or if you already have a narrative reason, maybe the Nehekarans are tying up the Lizardmen, so you want to have a reason to have a smaller force show up, and then maybe it's kind of planned ahead in advance that the Empire are going to win this battle, and then the Elector Count is kind of thinking, it's not a big deal. It's not a big deal, and then later on, the full force eventually arrives, and then after that, and like you have a big build-up third, I think we're going to kind of talk about this, you could turn a one-off into a little campaign. 3 series of games that kind of link. And just, you literally don't have to plan too far in advance.
Right.
It could just be, hey, X happened at the end of the game. Okay, what makes sense
for the next battle?
Battle. It doesn't, I think you'll see sometimes in these narrative campaigns, they'll do the tree system or whatever, which is fine, especially if you keep it really simple. But for, I think, people who are starting out, that can seem even a bit intimidating, especially when you're writing your own
coming
narrative.
Up with all of these contingencies.
Like, well, what happens if the Empire wins, but the Lizardmen get the MacGuffin? Like, well, then what happens, And it's just like, well, just don't actually map out every eventuality. Don't be, what is he, Doctor Strange, the guy looking at all the futures? Yeah. Don't be that guy. Just kind of figure out the one thing. And then just go from there after what happens and just let the dice fall where they go and then just pick the story up from there.
Yeah, I think that works. And then once you've done a few campaigns, you have a better stock of ideas of scenarios just in your head in a library, then it's easier to fill out a tree campaign or something like that as well. There was something you just said there that I wanted to pick the thread up on. And it was, the idea of like playing a losing battle as part of a campaign, which I think is really interesting. Because it could see, like, if you're just doing it as a one-off with no narrative, playing 500 points against 1,500 points sounds stupid. Who would ever do that? Why would you play that game? That's not fun. But if it's part of a campaign and that 500 points is sort of like free for you in the campaign sense because you're actually playing the Tomb Kings and you're just playing this first battle with the Lizardmen as part of this little narrative introduction, and whatever damage you happen to do to the Empire, they actually lose that permanently in the campaign. Now all of a sudden that's a really exciting scenario because like, yeah, I'm going to lose, but that's fine. I just need to do as much damage as possible. Right. And now it's like a really cool way to play a completely unbalanced scenario.
And maybe that's like a tweak there, just kind of flowing with that. Like maybe then you add the Lizardmen or whatever's running away from the Tomb Kings, get like a leadership bonus, or they retreat not in their table edge. Maybe that's they flee in a different direction because they're running away from a greater threat. They don't care about the Empire.
Right, they're gonna just run through them.
They're just like, get me the frick out of here or whatever. Or they're just give them all stubborn or something. Maybe it's a bunch of skinks come out or whatever, and it's like stubborn skinks. They probably still run. I don't know, but stuff like that, you could figure it out. And just letting, I guess for me, when I do make those tweaks, just thinking I'm kind of just consciousness right now, stream of consciousness. The narrative really informs those changes for me. So if I know like, oh yeah, they're fleeing from something, then I'm like, oh, well then why would they retreat? The Lizardmen, why would they retreat? Yeah. They're just like, they're going to fight to the death or they're going to flee the other way. And then you make the changes based on that. I'm 100%. Less like, well, how do we want to adjust the balance for this scenario? Which sometimes you do want to do, but I find, at least unless you got some really crazy objectives, a lot of the times that's so contingent on the forces themselves as well as the terrain that it's almost impossible to account for. Yeah,
but if you're going to give somebody a bonus like they all become stubborn, you probably want to give something to the Empire, whether that's more troops or they just have also some special ability. Who knows? But
they're 3 times as many points as an army or whatever.
Exactly.
Right? So, yeah. And just going into that with the right mindset, which hopefully you do. I don't think anybody goes into that thinking, oh, this is going to be a fair and balanced encounter. No, they go in saying, okay, let's see what happens.
Yeah.
Maybe it's a heck. The Scar veteran is actually going to, just somehow pull victory from the jaws of defeat here. Most likely not. But maybe he does. Maybe he goes down in a glorious last stands. Maybe he just gets chopped down and flees, man, and he just goes back through the portal, never to be seen of again. So many different things you can go with, I guess. And we've kind of, I'm just waxing. So
that's fine.
I'll stop.
Yeah, all good. Well, let's use that as a jumping off point then to just give a little, again, case study example of how we could turn this one Empire Lizardmen battle meeting engagement into a mini campaign, 3 games. So we'd start with this scenario as we've already described it. And then maybe if this was going to be part of a campaign, we would start with smaller forces. So maybe the Lizardmen and the Empire have both sent just vanguard forces through the portal and to the portal initially to see what's going on. And maybe that's like 1,000 points then or something like that. The Slon's not going to be there yet because he didn't want to show up on the doorstep first. It just makes me think of something like Stargate SG-1. They send the robot through first to see what's on the other side.
Right.
So maybe, you do this first battle at 1,000 points and then you can build up to a more major battle. So maybe the winner of that first scenario has gained some insight into their enemy's strengths. Because we started with smaller vanguards, it wasn't really about capturing the portal, so we don't have to worry about like the Empire won, so now the Lizardmen are just stopped and will never enter this land because they weren't trying to hold the territory. They were just doing some recon and we're going to fall back anyways. And so maybe that means that we use one of those options like the winner gets to choose their side of the battlefield and whether to start first or second in the next battle. So that's something nice and simple. Maybe we still just do another random scenario or something, or maybe we pick one. And then, of course, I just love veterancy, so maybe we throw that into this little mini campaign as well. So each player gets to pick one of their units that had at least 50% of its unit strength left at the end of the battle, and they gain that one level of reroll veterancy.
And then you name the unit.
Yes, that's actually a good way to do that. If you don't want to name your whole army at once, just name them when they become a veteran unit. Yeah, that's a lot of fun. And then that may give you some more inspiration for the name as well, because you can name them about the thing they did. In our last campaign, I had Yorith's Croc Slayers were my Dwarf Slayers unit because, I don't need to tell that whole story right now, but they got that name. There was a
great story.
Yeah. So that was really good. So that's a great point as well. But for us, we're going to make the second scenario breakthrough. So it's this idea that the Lizardmen have come out of the portal and they're now trying to push through an Empire picket line in order to get better footing for their final assault. In this case, if the Lizardmen win, maybe in the final battle, they get to deploy D6 inches closer because they've gotten to the battlefield before the Empire was fully prepared. Whereas if the Empire wins, maybe they get an additional 12 inches of linear obstacles, fences, stone walls, something like that, because they've had that time to prepare. And so that's not going to be completely game breaking, but it's something that, it's going to help the Lizardmen get across the field and hit the enemy line quicker. It's going to help the Empire play that little bit more defensively and give them a little edge, but I don't think break the game. You could do this at 1,500 points. So again, you're kind of slowly building up to the bigger battle. And then you could do the final scenario could be capture. So maybe the artifact is now in the Wizard's Tower. The capture objective in the center of the battlefield is the Wizard's Tower. And so whoever holds the Wizard's Tower at the end of the battle has won the campaign. They've now got the artifact in their possession. One thing I think is worth pointing out is when we've played this scenario, we've modified it a little bit in its original writing. It just says whoever has a unit closest to the center objective wins. But that it's very easy for both players to just be touching it. Yeah. And so that just quickly becomes weird. And also just feel a little weird if it's like, I got one Bretonnian peasant in base contact and you have a unit of 20 Saurus warriors in contact and somehow we're tied. So we just use unit strength. So combined unit strength within a certain distance. I don't know what we've done before, but like 1 inch or 3 inches or something like that. And then you could do this at a full 2,000 points. So now you've done a little bit of a build up from 1,000 points, 1,500, 2,000 points. You've got this story that's going through the Empire trying to find out what's going on. The lizards coming out to get their artifact and then working back towards the Wizard's Tower where the final battle is going to take place. And the Slan is either going to be successful or the wizard will get to hang on to his whatchamacallit.
Right. And that's just examples. You could, I'm sure listeners probably, when we were describing the first battle originally, could have gone in their own imaginations in very different directions. Maybe this turns into like a weird siege thing at the end or whatever, you could go.
Absolutely. They could be assaulting the Count's castle by the end of this.
Yeah. Who knows? Right. So I just like the open-ended and being willing to be open-ended. Now, obviously, if you terrain and stuff, work within your limits or whatever. Yeah. And, but I just think there's so many possibilities out there and we almost limit ourselves by just not even beginning to explore. Mm-hmm. And I think I see that most of all because I was there. I was just I'm going to play Steamroller, which was the Warhammer competitive thing. It was called Steamroller. Those were the
War Machine.
Yeah, War Machine. Sorry, War Machine was Steamroller was the competitive scenario pack, and it's like you have these big circles that you need to stand in, and you get points. And then there's these circles that if you touch, you get points. Mm-hmm. And that's like it's competitively balanced, and it's always the same every time. The objectives don't move. Yeah, sure, there's different ones, and you build to try to accomplish all these different things, and that does something for sure. But if we could have somehow injected flavor into all of that, it would have elevated the entire thing times 10. And I was just never able to do that 5-10 years ago. Yeah, and I see the other side of that now, and it's so much more engrossing. And I just wish for other people who were like me 10 years ago, if you were the guy just playing Steamroller with cutting your terrain out of construction paper. I'm not saying you got to go out and like buy a 3D printer and
Warhammer is totally legitimate way to play.
Legit. No, nothing wrong with playing with books as terrain. Done that for many years. I get it, but just like being willing to experiment with scenarios, being willing to experiment with them narratively as well, and let them both the scenario as well as the narrative feed into one another. Yeah. And then create something fresh and new that you probably wouldn't have experienced or even attempted otherwise.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is where I'd like to reconnect back to probably the introduction we talked about this, but the idea that people often seem to think that it's a dichotomy. You either are a competitive player or you are a narrative player. And I don't think that that's true. Those things are not mutually exclusive. You can be a really skilled player that knows the game really well and plays really well and puts together really good combinations of troops and tactics and things like that while still embracing all of this narrative stuff. And so I guess what we hope to bring with this podcast is just the sense of ways that you can do that you can embrace both of those sides of the hobby and become a better player if you're more in it for the narrative, but also lean more into the narrative if you find yourself tending towards just thinking in terms of mechanics all the time.
Right. Yeah. No. I guess that's all I have. But any final takeaways for you for just scenarios in general and the value, I guess, that they bring?
Yeah, I'm just a sucker for a good scenario. I think it just gives me the story hooks to imagine the battle that's actually happening. It really helps me get less frustrated when I'm losing because I can see just more of the cinematic nature of the battle unfolding. And like I said at the beginning, it's just feels like the logical conclusion of all the work and effort I've put into building and painting my army and building terrain and things like that is having an actual story that I'm telling with them to like fully bring it to that point. So yeah, I love it. I'd love to hear from any of you listening. If you have cool scenarios that you've written and tried for this or other games, let us know. We'd love to hear how they went, or even if you want to post the scenarios themselves, maybe we'll give them a try. But yeah, we'd love to hear all those stories that you guys have as well.
For sure. And my final point will just be, I'll try to keep it brief.
No worries.
Just the idea that scenarios bring variety and freshness to something that can sometimes become mundane. And I think a lot of people will naturally start playing scenarios, but they typically keep to the book, but they don't experiment too much.
Mm-hmm.
Just be willing to experiment and see how your group reacts. See if you find yourselves being a little more hype. You know, I find like when we're talking about the build up to that 4-way game, people were just like, I mean, admittedly, it's a Discord chat amongst friends, so I'm sure those of you listening who have group chats know how that can go. But just this idea, it was like built up to, it was this event.
Yeah.
You know, it wasn't just, it's Thursday night or whatever.
Yeah, we had to like carve out a Saturday where we could put 5 or 6 hours into it.
Yeah,
and have food and
it was a big thing, and I don't know if I'm ever going to forget that. And if we were just playing pitched battle or something, it might have just been another game, and I don't know if I would really remember it as vividly.
Yeah.
So that's my final comment. I think with that, we'll probably close it up. This has been Refused Flank, and I'm Grant.
And I'm Cam. So until next time, play some games, design some scenarios, and name all your characters.
Yes, name all your characters, and maybe think about your units too. But okay, bye.